Final Fantasy games have been well known for their elaborate CGI movies. These pre-rendered sequences have typically highlighted huge action scenes or major story beats, key in-game moments where real-time rendering might prove insufficient. But high-quality CGI is all but absent from the recently released Final Fantasy XVI, with a mix of real-time and pre-rendered in-engine footage largely used instead. Though it's hard not to miss the beautiful CGI, Final Fantasy XVI definitely has better looking real-time visuals than prior series entries, with greater fidelity to pull off the same cinematic feats running on actual console hardware. So today I thought we'd take a look at the last mainline Final Fantasy title to make especially heavy use of CGI, which is 2010's Final Fantasy XIII. And see just how close the latest Final Fantasy adventure gets with its real-time graphics. Just how close is Final Fantasy XVI? And could it actually exceed the CGI movies of its predecessor? The Final Fantasy series has used less and less CGI over the past decade or so. Final Fantasy XIII featured almost an hour of beautiful CGI footage, but Final Fantasy XIV, XV, and Final Fantasy VII Remake have only used CGI for a few key sequences per game, like the opening and closing movies. And Final Fantasy XVI, to my eyes, appears to feature no fully offline CGI sequences, with just a limited use of pre-rendered video on occasion that's entirely or almost entirely in-engine. So if significant use of CGI is a thing of the past for Final Fantasy, can Final Fantasy XVI replicate the same glory within the strict budgets of real-time rendering? The characters in Final Fantasy XIII were lavishly rendered in CGI form. Excellent materials were paired with very detailed models, highlighted of course by the signature expressive Final Fantasy hair. If you do look closely, you can make out occasional flaws, like the broken shadow on Snow's face here, but generally speaking the work holds up quite well. Final Fantasy XVI matches up quite nicely here overall. Materials are very high quality. Just look at how the different cloth materials look here, or how Benedicta's leather outfit has a beautiful semi-gloss tone. Metals are particularly striking, with varying specular and roughness depending on the finish. Skin rendering can actually look a bit better in Final Fantasy XVI, as Final Fantasy XIII's skin can have a bit of a synthetic sheen, particularly in indirectly lit conditions. Final Fantasy XVI's skin tends to have a subtle subsurface scattering derived glow to it, while FF13 can have a mildly glossy look under certain light that doesn't look great. Character model detail across both efforts is pretty respectable, with FF16 falling behind for sure, but acquitting itself well enough, I would say. The key deficit in 16 comes down to physics. Offline CG has the benefit of being able to rely on complex physics for clothing and hair, so you can get super fine physics interactions on screen. Games are typically limited to much cruder movement, and it really does show here. Hair is a particular sore spot for 16, as the card-based locks are surprisingly static. Even with gale force winds, the hair tends to stay pretty planted on the models' heads, whereas in Final Fantasy XIII it can move very dynamically. The actual appearance of the static hair looks great in some shots, but under movement it doesn't look convincing. It is worth pointing out that other real-time efforts, including Final Fantasy VII Remake, have more lively hair, so other similar titles can have a bit less of a deficit. FF13's lighting looks excellent in most CGI scenes. This high-speed chase with snow is a great example. Just look at the way that sunlight bounces off the sand here, for instance, with very convincing secondary lighting. The fireworks cinematic is another highlight in my opinion. Shadows, though, are a bit less convincing. The softness of shadows seems to change from scene to scene, without a simulation of variable penumbra as the shadow becomes more distant from the object casting it. The shadows often look way too sharp, which is especially obvious outdoors. The grass here is a particular eyesore, casting bold, dark shadows that seem inappropriate for semi-transparent objects. In some scenes we do get very soft, properly diffused shadows, but a lot of the time the results look a little bit off. Final Fantasy XVI has quite comparable environmental lighting in some spots, albeit with a limited ability to resolve fine detail. But dynamic lighting is a bit more mixed, which is typical of the game using a baked GI solution. Its shadow rendering, however, is comprehensively better than the solutions that were used in Final Fantasy XIII. We get very detailed shadows with realistic variable penumbra, and they look appropriate regardless of circumstance. It's not totally clear what Square is doing here. They could be ray traced, like the RT shadows in Forspoken, or could be using a technology like virtual shadow maps. But the results are excellent in either case. The critical development is that shadows look very true to life, and don't exhibit typical shadow map issues like breakup at oblique angles. Environmental rendering is a bit of a mixed bag across FF13's CGI cinematics. The main emphasis is very much on the characters here, and backgrounds are often relegated to out-of-focus shots or even matte paintings. The 3D modeling tends to be on the simpler side, with low frequency detail and somewhat limited density, especially relative to the principal cast. It's probably fair to say that Final Fantasy XVI tends to have more detailed environments as a result, though it's much more of a focus here than in the prior title's CGI sequences. Some of the more constrained spaces particularly impress, with a satisfying density of foliage and geometric clutter. Environmental reflections can be a bit of a sore spot, though they aren't featured too prominently outside of the game's water rendering. Here, Final Fantasy XIII does fare quite a bit better, with perspective correct, though uniformly sharp, reflections coverage. Depth of field and motion blur are often maligned by gamers, but fundamentally these are basic properties of the way that optical systems work, including digital cameras and the human eye. And they prove very useful for artistic purposes as well. On a 2D plane without any depth information for our eyes to focus on, these visual artifacts help to guide us towards logical focal points, shaping how we consume flat panel content. Final Fantasy XVI is the first mainline Final Fantasy title to use both bokeh depth of field and full camera and object motion blur during real-time sequences, and the results are terrific. I'm especially impressed by the depth of field, which looks stunning and presents with very few issues. In some scenes, the virtual camera even racks focus smoothly as the focal point shifts. There are minor artifacts around fine details like hair at times, but it's a very impressive implementation of a technique that can be quite hard to get right. Final Fantasy XIII's CGI sequences feature the same effects with broadly similar impact. Of course, both the motion blur and depth of field here are artifact-free, unconstrained by the strict performance windows needed for real-time imagery. But in most viewing situations, I'd chalk this up as a draw basically, as Final Fantasy XVI's flaws aren't often visible in motion. Image quality throws a bit of a curveball when evaluating the two titles. On the one hand, Final Fantasy XVI is delivering a big increase in image detail and clarity over Final Fantasy XIII's CGI. We're looking at a dynamic 1440p presentation in graphics mode here, paired off against 720p CGI after all. But that's not quite the whole story, as the CGI in Final Fantasy XIII is effectively super sampled and has a perfectly smooth look that even holds up quite well on a high resolution display. FF16 may fare slightly better here on the whole, but it does come saddled with occasional aliasing that you rarely see in high-end CG productions. Lastly, let's take a bit of a detour from visual features and discuss content for a moment. The motivation behind the use of CGI in earlier Final Fantasy games was to emphasize important moments that wouldn't fare well when squeezed by the constraints of a game engine. This usually included the game's lavish, beautifully choreographed action scenes. These death-defying combat maneuvers were showcased in incredibly cool cinematics that really stood alone in gaming at the time. Final Fantasy XVI does have similar in-engine cinematic combat showcases, though they are fewer in number and somewhat brief. They're cool and definitely reminiscent of earlier CGI efforts, but aren't quite up to the same bar in my opinion. But on the flip side, the playable combat does animate and flow very nicely, including a number of large-scale fights that look stunning. There's a bit less excitement in the uninteractive sequences, but the gameplay features a lot of big action moments, which is a pretty good trade-off. When I first played Final Fantasy XIII, the CGI cutscenes absolutely blew me away. The visuals were extremely sophisticated, and the use of characters and areas that I had just seen in-game invited my mind to wander a little bit. Exactly how long would we have to wait to see similar visuals in real time in a video game? Final Fantasy XVI isn't quite at that level, I would say, but it comes surprisingly close. We're seeing a fairly similar style realized with broadly similar visuals in a lot of respects. It's a bit bittersweet that the CGI seems to have been dropped for the latest Final Fantasy entry, but the real-time visuals are accomplishing things that prior Final Fantasy titles struggled with. From character rendering to lighting to environmental detail and post-processing effects, it's all quite impressive, to the point where honestly CGI feels unnecessary. There are a few caveats to this analysis that I wanted to mention. FF16 is a big game, and expectedly there are some areas where the visual presentation falls flat. This mostly comes down to the lower tier cutscenes, which animate rather stiffly and feature simpler models. Key sequences have much better production values, and I've focused more on those today. But conversely, Final Fantasy XIII CGI isn't all quite at the same quality level either. More indirectly lit environments can look a bit off in a few moments, and skin rendering appears excellent in some scenes and sort of mediocre in others. Some shots do make use of paintings and game engine footage, mixed in with all the 3D CGI. And of course, the vast majority of cutscenes aren't anywhere near this level of fidelity. Of the roughly 9 hours of cutscenes in Final Fantasy XIII, only an hour is high-quality CGI, with the rest split between real-time and in-engine pre-rendered footage. And if we measure Final Fantasy XVI against the slightly earlier era of Square Enix CGI, from 2006's Final Fantasy XII or 2005's Final Fantasy VII Advent Children feature film, FF16 fares substantially better. The main issue here is the quality of the materials work on key elements like skin and fabric, which doesn't look very good in retrospect. Other elements of the rendering hold up better, but measured against Final Fantasy XVI taken as a whole, I prefer FF16's real-time rendering overall. There's still some ways to go before Final Fantasy games reach the peaks of the pre-rendered visuals featured in prior games, and a few areas where achieving offline results in a real-time renderer may simply be off the table. In broad strokes though, it does seem like 2 generations past Final Fantasy XIII, real-time game graphics are approaching, and in a few areas actually exceeding, the ultra-high-end CGI that Square Enix once relied on. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.